Welcome, everybody, to the 224 Mary Keating Das lecture. We have two more people heading this way. Yeah, there's a couple more seats down here. Okay. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Mary Keating Das, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit about our honored speaker. Mary Keating Das was a founding member of both the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Women's Party. She and her husband, Taraknath Das, established the Taraknath Das Foundation in 1930 to offer grants and prizes to individuals working towards a better understanding among nations. When Mary Keating Das died in 1948, her husband established an endowment at Columbia that included a provision for this lecture series. The early lecturers included Eleanor Roosevelt and several ambassadors moving in both directions from India and to India. And there is a complete list of the lectures beginning in 1949 that can now be found on the South Asia Institute website, thanks to the archival work of Bill Carrick. So I wanted to be sure people were aware of that. We are honored today to have Professor Richard Eaton for today's Mary Keating Das lecture, speaking on that topic. So you can read it better than I could say it. Professor Eaton has been in the history department at the University of Arizona since 1972, he tells me. So 50 years or so. He received his PhD from in history from the University of Wisconsin, working under the supervision of Mughal historian John Richards, who was a dear colleague of mine back at Duke when I was there. He has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, the National Humanities Center, and other places. And he has won a number of prizes, I think the most recent being from the the Association for Asian Studies in 2023 for significant contributions to Asian studies in the previous 4 years, I think. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Dick is perhaps best known for bringing pre-modern India to life through his deeply researched and prolific scholarship on social and cultural history between 1000 and 1800, drawing primarily on Persianate sources with a focus on Islam in South Asia and the range of historical interactions between Iran and India. He's published monographs on the social roles of Sufis in the Sultanate of Bijapur from 1300 to 1700, the growth of Islam in Bengal from basically the 13th century through 1760, the social history of the Deccan from 1300 to 1761, and the use of memory, architecture, and material culture to understand contested sites on the Deccan Plateau between 1300 and 1600. In 2020, he published a survey on India's middle period called India in the Persianate Age, 1000 to 1765. I won't mention the specifics of his 11 or so books. I didn't count them exactly, but it was something like that, except for the prize winners. His 2014 book, Power, Memory, Architecture, Contested Sites on India's Deccan Plateau, 1300 to 1600, co-authored with Phillip Wagoner, won both the A.K. Coomaraswamy Prize in 2016 for the best book on South Asia and the John F. Richards Prize for the best book on South Asian history. His 1993 book, The Rise of Islam in the Bengal Frontier, 1204 to 1760, also won the A.K. Coomaraswamy Prize in 1995, as well as the Albert Hourani Prize for the best book on Middle Eastern studies. I first met Dick in Pakistan when I was doing field work back in the mid-1970s, and there's been a lot of reminiscing about that over the last few hours. And he was, I was there doing my dissertation fieldwork, and he was researching the shrine of Baba Farid. My conversations with him about this research and his 1978 book, Sufis of Bijapur, which came out shortly thereafter, played a major role in my own efforts to bring together my ethnographic research on Sufis with the historical legacy of Sufism in South Asia. And of course he sent me his CV so I could prepare this, and I can't resist mentioning a section of his CV, a rather unusual Borges-like category, innocuously entitled Other Honors at the very end of the CV. Its subcategories include published work plagiarized by others, books banned by foreign governments, books illegally translated in pirated editions, along with recognition for teaching and recognition for scholarship. The latter, recognition for scholarship, suggests the perhaps tongue-in-cheek tone of the whole category. The first one was declared liberal India's favorite Western scholar in the headline in the Hindustan Times of New Delhi in 2010. And he was listed among the 9 all-time historians of India whose biographies were included in the Encyclopedia of Historians and Historical Writing, edited by Kelly Boyd. And the first non-Indian historian of India mentioned since al-Biruni, who died in 1950. Your lovely prose. I'm almost done. Dick has had a long-standing interest in the relationship between architecture and power, especially on what happens when power confronts monuments of earlier dispensations, defeated rulers, oppressed minorities, and other phenomena, which is the focus of today's talk. The talk will consider the fate of Buddhism in India, one of the most vexed issues in Indian history. I won't say more because you will tell us all. So please join me in welcoming Richard.
Kathy, that was stupendous. Thank you so much for that over-the-top but generous introduction. It's a great honor to be with you all tonight. Thank you all for showing up. The one word you might not have heard in that introduction was the word Buddhism, which is important to note because, as many of you know, this is a little bit outside my usual comfort zone. But it's a kind of a flip side of one of the questions that has intrigued me for a long time, namely, how did so much of Eastern India become Islamic? The other side of that could be framed as, what happened to Buddhism? So there is a connection with that earlier concern. But this is really very preliminary, and some of the ideas I'm going to throw out here tonight are unfinished, to put it mildly. So I certainly welcome your comments, questions, and advice from some of you who have actually worked on Buddhism for longer than I have. And the other caveat I want to say is that I'm not going to be trying to talk about all of India, despite what you see on this title. I'm going to focus just on the eastern part, Bihar especially, and Bengal. Some time ago, I published an article on temple desecration in India, written in the aftermath of the destruction of the Babri Masjid. Apologists for that destruction had justified their actions on the premise not only that the mosque had been built over a temple to the god Rama, but that destroying that mosque was only one tiny compensation for more than 6 centuries of Indo-Muslim demolition of thousands of temples. So my aim then was simply to investigate how many temples actually had been destroyed by Indo-Muslim rulers. And unlike claims of Hindu nationalists that many thousands of temples were destroyed, my study came up with only 80, a number that I have since revised up to 82, and I'm sure that number will keep on going higher as research keeps on going on. But anyway, in this talk I have two aims. One is to revisit this earlier study with a view to exploring a more detailed model of how politics and architecture are interrelated. Whereas that original study had rather crudely asked which temples were destroyed, by whom, where, when, and in what context, a later study that I did working with Phil Wagoner taught me that there are more options than just destruction that were available to states when confronting monuments associated with defeated adversaries. So now I want to ask, what were some of those other options, and why were they chosen? My second aim is to bring some of these insights to bear on this larger question of Buddhism in Indian history. And again, I'm going to be focusing only on Eastern India. I do not want to fall into that well-known historian's trap of monocausalism, to try to find a single magic bullet that will explain everything. We're lucky if we can explain anything in Indian history. But I do want to take a crack at Eastern India and put that in the context of this, a typology that I want to propose. So regarding the range of options, open to ruling authorities when dealing with monuments of defeated adversaries, or when occupying new territory, I propose a typology of 7 possible responses according to degree of intervention, ranging from doing nothing to all-out demolition. So, violent responses to religious structures of one's adversaries were by no means the rule. In fact, they were the exception. By far the most common response to monuments identified with adversaries was to leave them alone, so long as they didn't serve to legitimize an enemy state. In Mexico, for example, temples like that of Teotihuacan, just 40 miles north of Mexico City, were left untouched. Having been built 1,000 years before the Aztecs, they were abandoned 900 years before the Spaniards arrived. So since the great temple complex was not at all associated with the Aztecs or any of the Spaniards' enemies, it was left untouched. We see the same thing in India, such as the famous temple complex at Khajuraho. This had been the capital of North India's Chandala dynasty, but by the time the Turks reached the area in the 13th century, early 13th century, that dynasty had declined to such a degree that it was politically irrelevant. So even though the site lay in the path of Turkish armies as they moved down the Gangetic Plain, the temple was ignored, just as the Spaniards would ignore Teotihuacan. Same is true of other great temples that were formally identified with powerful states, such as the Thousand Pillar Temple at Hanamkonda, which had housed the image of the cosmic overlord of the Kakatiya dynasty in the eastern Deccan. In 1195, however, that dynasty's capital was shifted to nearby Warangal, just only 3 miles away. And when Turkish armies conquered the Deccan in 1323, the royal temple in the dynasty's former capital at Hanamkonda, being politically irrelevant, like a light bulb going out, was left untouched, whereas the Swayambhu Shiva temple at the Kakatiya's active capital at Warangal was totally demolished. In fact, politically irrelevant temples like that of Hanamkonda were not only left unharmed, but they were normally protected. In practice, Indo-Muslim rulers regarded all fixed property within a state's sovereign domain as state property, and therefore deserving of state protection. But on the other hand, should the patron of a Hindu temple rebel against Turkish authority, both he and the temple he patronized would be punished. Typically, the patron would lose his life, while the temple would be desecrated. A second response I want to suggest here is imitation. When states expand their territory into new land, the land of a former adversary, a common option is to plant new monuments that visibly express the state's ideology while also engaging in what Ola Gabrar calls the symbolic appropriation of the land. And for this purpose, architects and patrons often draw upon a remembered past that expressed their own identity and their claims to the land. Typical response is to replicate or imitate iconic models. To come kind of home here, for the fledgling United States, the iconic Parthenon captured the founders' ideal of Greek democracy. So when laying claim to ruling over much of North America, they replicated that structure in the Supreme Court. They did the same thing to project architecturally their ideal of political immortality, for which purpose you simply planned an icon associated with ancient Egypt and their obsession with immortality. In India, too, one witnesses architectural imitation when the sultans of Delhi initially annexed portions of the Deccan Plateau in the early 14th century. The first mosque they built was the Jami Masjid in Dowlatabad. In its ground plan, the mosque imitates that of the first great mosque of the Delhi Sultanate, the Qutub Minar. Yes. What is more interesting, though, I think, is this mosque also featured engaged corner columns that imitated the most iconic image of the Sultanate's power, which is the famous Qutub Minar, integral to the Qutub Mosque, thereby visibly projecting Delhi's presence in a province 1,000 miles away. It had formerly been enemy territory. Then we come to iconic reuse, a variation, which is really a variation of imitation. Situations where instead of merely replicating an iconic image of some sort, the image itself was physically transported to a new context, sometimes many centuries after it had been made. In that new context, the image was then strategically and publicly displayed so as to establish a direct visual link between the present and a glorious past. An instance of this is seen in the efforts of Charlemagne to establish his own direct link with Rome. So when in 793 he begins construction of his Palatine chapel in northern Germany, he transports from Italy Roman columns that dated to a period some 400 years earlier, and he places them in the chapel complex. So we find the same thing in India. In the northern Deccan, rulers of Vijayanagara sought to display a visual link between themselves and the powerful and prestigious Chalukya Empire, the Kalyana Chalukya Empire, which had ruled over the entire plateau between the 10th and 12th centuries, and whose memory was cherished for its finely carved and highly polished columns. You see them here. These columns became iconic of the dynasty and were remembered long after its demise in the mid-12th century. So, in the early 16th century, Vijayanagara's rulers installed several spectacular Chalukya period columns in a hall right here, directly opposite Vijayanagara's principal temple, that of Virupaksha. Whereas the columns in the hall's upper level were crudely fashioned from local materials that were not readily visible from ground level. These guys up here. 12 finely carved Chalukya period columns were placed at street level so as to be visually prominent. This is found in the capital in Vijayanagara's so-called sacred center, the terms used by John Fritz and George Michel. In the city's so-called royal center, however, we get a very different aesthetic. Here the rulers sought to project their participation in the contemporary, that is 16th century Persianate world, stretching from the Balkans to Bengal. So here's another example of imitation, or emulation, of which I just spoke. But they also wanted to display their association with the remembered indigenous imperial power of the Deccan, these same Chalukyas. So we find here a stunning Chalukya period step tank that was physically dismantled from some unknown site and then reassembled in the heart of the city in the early 16th century. But before it was disassembled, each of the tank's carved stones had been carefully numbered and lettered so it could be reconstructed in precisely the same way in the heart of downtown Chalukya, Vijayanagara, the same way that its Chalukya patrons had built it some 400 years earlier. It's fascinating that the Charlemagne does his chapel, Palatine Chapel in northern Germany, about 400 years after the collapse of Rome, but the memory of Rome remains there. And here again, the same 4 centuries are passed before this extraordinary temple or septank appears. So, another way that a state used architecture to interact with a defeated enemy was by seizing something associated with it and displaying it prominently for its own domestic audience. Unlike iconic reuse, where a patron proudly displays an artifact from a distant but prestigious past by way of connecting itself to that past, with trophies, the idea is to seize the icon from a contemporary enemy and display it at home to publicly signal its triumph over that enemy. St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, for example, is one of the most prominent monuments in that city, if not in all of Italy. Located directly above its principal entrance, however, you see these 4 bronze horses that had been seized from their original home in the Hippodrome of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, 1204. Although Roman Catholic crusaders had been sent to confront Muslims in Palestine, those on this operation never got past Constantinople, which they sacked since it was the capital of their Greek Orthodox rivals. And the 4 horses, proudly displayed on St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, announced the Crusaders' triumph over their Greek rivals. Now, there are many examples in India of the same kind of thing, including a sculptured door guardian here that the Cholas seized from their Chalukya enemies in 1045. And in this instance, the victors even included an inscription on the base of the statue, boasting of having burned the Chalukya's capital. 23 years earlier, Chola armies had marched clear to Bengal, 1,000 miles to the north, where they sacked the temple of the Pala Maharaja and carried this image of Shiva back down to Tamil Nadu, again, as a war trophy. Another way of dealing with structures of defeated enemies was to redefine those structures in a way that completely altered their original purpose. 2.5 centuries after Western European invaders had sacked Constantinople, Fourth Crusade, Ottoman Turks conquered the city in 1453. But unlike those crusaders, the Turks intended to remain in the city. And since they admired the architectural achievements of the Byzantines, whom they had just conquered, instead of demolishing the most iconic emblem of Byzantine power, the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, they appropriated it by transforming it from a church to a mosque. This they did simply by removing the cross from the dome and adding 4 prominent minarets around the structure. In Spain, the reverse happened when Christians reclaimed the city of Cordoba in the 13th century. The great mosque of Cordoba had itself been built on the site of on a Visigoth Christian church, which Muslims had demolished when they conquered the region in 758. Well, when Christians reconquered the city, they converted the structure back to a church by building a Gothic chapel in the heart of the former mosque and by converting the minaret into a bell tower. Now, to come to the present. In China today, a very similar, strikingly similar thing is happening as the PRC tightens its control over historically Muslim territories, including Henan in the interior, Yunnan in the south, and especially in the so-called autonomous regions, namely Ningxia Hui in the north and Xinjiang in the far west, the latter being home to the much persecuted Uyghurs. Now, we should recall that when Muslims first made a significant appearance in Greater China, they sought to merge with Chinese aesthetics, as we see in this mosque dating to the Mongol or perhaps early Ming period. But many mosques did not survive Mao's Cultural Revolution of the late 60s and 70s. However, mosques built between Mao's death and the rise of Xi Jinping in 2013 showed no attempt to identify with the greater Persianate world by using pointed arches, vaulting, domes, or minarets, as we see in this mosque in Waizhou. But in recent years, the PRC has been imposing their own Han Chinese aesthetic on all their territories, as happened to the Waizhou Mosque, whose domes, minarets, pointed arches were all replaced, as you see here. Yet significantly, a 19th century Catholic cathedral built in the same city by colonial French authorities was left untouched. If we look north to the Ningxia-Hui autonomous region in north of Waizhou, we see a mosque built in Yinchuan, that region's capital. It too was forcibly and radically remodeled by government fiat. There you have it. Very close to Beijing is the largest mosque in all of northern China, the Grand Mosque of Fangshan, where we see the same thing happening. Right there it is. After Sinization. Even the pointed arches were removed from the lower portion here. We see the same thing also in government plans for the Grand Mosque of Xining. Here, the idea is to simply chisel off the entire upper half of the structure, transforming the edifice into looking something like a government post office. Here we go. Right now you have what is actually still a mosque. So you notice they haven't changed the identity of the thing. They're simply making it, as Xi Jinping would say, harmonious with China, with Han China. Of course, in India too, we see precisely the opposite happening in this structure, which began as a Kakatiya temple, but in 14th century, in Bodan, Deccan. Here, interestingly, the city's governor, who had converted to Islam, transformed the Kakatiya temple into a mosque by simply adding domes, a lot of domes to kind of make the point, to the roof. And in the interior, he simply adds a mihrab. Fortunately, of course, the temple was facing Mecca, due west from this part of India, so nothing else had to be done. Then I want to come briefly to strategic defacement, moving along this typology, moving toward total demolition, where you transform a structure's identity by strategic defacement. The Protestant Reformation provides plenty of examples of Gothic structures being rendered unusable as cathedrals. Here is the former Cathedral of St. Martin's in Utrecht, built in 1254. But in 1566, Protestant vandals chiseled off its icons, making it unusable for Roman Catholics. In the Deccan, something of the same sort happened soon after the pivotal Battle of Talakota in 1565, when Vijayanagar was defeated by a coalition of Deccan sultanates, of which the greatest beneficiary was Bijapur. And after that battle, Sultan Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur advanced south into territory that had formerly been under Vijayanagar's domain. During this campaign, he transformed a prominent ancient temple in Bankapur, then patronized by an enemy Raja, into a mosque. In doing so, the same thing the Protestants did in Utrecht. He chiseled off parts of images around the temple's outer walls. So finally we come to demolition, and I want to distinguish what I'm calling, you can all see, the strategic demolition from total demolition. A classic example is the Spanish attempt of the former, of total demolition. Is the Spanish attempt to eradicate any trace of Aztec political culture when they conquered Mexico in the early 16th century. But sometimes new regimes sought to preserve remnants of former structures by way of preserving the memory of having uprooted a former adversary. And this is interesting. This would be, I think, a strategic demolition. It's exactly what happened. This is back to Mexico. They're trying to obviously recover what they can of the original Great Pyramid in the Zocalo, at the center of Mexico City. But moving back to the Protestant Reformation, now we're in Scotland, whose foundational cathedral, that of St. Andrews, had been established way back in 1168. But in the mid-16th century, when John Knox led the Protestant Reformation in Scotland, the idea was not to level the cathedral, but rather to keep parts of it visible, deliberately visible, for posterity. And here you see, this is a reconstruction of what the cathedral probably looked like back in the 12th century, and here is what it looks like today, where they preserve this Gothic entranceway, one tower, the rest of it's for the apse and the cathedral proper would be right here. This is a graveyard. And the same thing happens, by the way, in Xinjiang, just last September. Now Xinjiang, you recall, is the westernmost periphery of China, the PRC. And here, as with St. Andrew's Cathedral, the facade and the main gate were retained, but most everything else was leveled. Only the pointed archway, you see, the dome towers, and the crescent were left intact. The crescent, very pointed, because that really emphasizes this was a mosque. We don't want you to forget what it was, because the message here seems to be. Now, why this kind of destruction, this kind of performative, you could almost say, destruction? I think it has a lot to do with geography. We go back to the map. That mosque you just saw is way out in the western edge of everything, in Kashgar, Uyghur country. And I think that explains a lot. It's 2,500 miles from Beijing to Xinjiang. And the Uyghurs, of course, we all know, are victims of the government's harshest crackdown, condemned by many as cultural genocide. But this strategic demolition seems to be the exception by the PRC, not the rule. The more typical strategy, as we've just seen, was to leave mosques to be mosques, but to simply make them look properly Chinese. Now, moving to contemporary India, we see a less nuanced approach to dealing with mosques. What you see here is the Akunji Masjid, what it looked like just a month ago, when the BJP government sent bulldozers into South Delhi at 4 o'clock a.m. to demolish the structure on the grounds of illegal encroachment. It had been there for 600 years. This is what it looked like. We think, architecturally, it seems to be approximately 600 years old. So demolition of religious structures in India, of course, is hardly new. From the late 12th century, Turkish armies quickly understood that for centuries, temples patronized by enemy Maharajas had been sites where power was regularly established, reconfirmed, and contested. Therefore, from at least the 7th century, royal temples were systematically attacked and desacralized by Indian kings seeking to conquer their political enemies. Understanding this, the Turks followed suit and singled out for destruction those temples that were associated with their royal enemies. That was true in North India, as the Ghurids moved swiftly down the Gangetic Plain in the early 13th century. You see Khajuraho just outside that zone. And it was also true when the Tughlaqs moved into the Deccan in the mid-14th century, which, as I already mentioned, when Ulugh Khan marched on Warrangal, the capital of the Kakatiya dynasty, he had bypassed that dynasty's former capital in Haramkonda simply because it was politically irrelevant. But the active capital of the Kakatiyas in 1323 was the site of their cosmic overlord, Swayambhu Shiva. Although the temple itself was demolished to the ground, its 4 stunning entrance gates, or toranas, were strategically left standing. There's one of the four right there. The Tughluq's intention seems to have been to build a mosque on the site of the ruined temple and to frame that mosque by using those same four toranas. Now, all that remains of the mosque are these several columns, but you can see one of the four toranas here in the background. Doing so provided clear evidence of a total break with the region's political past, while the standing toranas, however, served to remind the population of what it was that had been replaced. So, with this framework in mind, I want to now explore the fate of Buddhism in North India, Eastern India especially, at the time of the Turkish invasions and after. The traumatic years from 1192 to 1204 are conventionally seen as critical in this regard, especially the year 1202 or perhaps 1203, we're not sure, when Turkish arms based in central Afghanistan first encountered Buddhist institutions in the eastern Gangetic Plain. For a decade after 1192, Muhammad of Ghor had been directing a series of raids on Upper India before his slave generals then moved down the Gangetic Plain clear to Bengal. The campaign in Bihar and Bengal was famously led by one of those generals, Bakhtiyar Khilji. An important source for Bakhtiyar's encounter with Buddhist institutions is the chronicle Tabaqat-e-Nasiri by Minhaj-e-Din Juzjani. In 1243, Juzjani was in Bengal, where he actually met and conversed with two brothers, two soldiers actually, who had actually taken part in the Turkish campaign 40 years earlier. So in effect, the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri is nearly an eyewitness account, virtually an eyewitness account of this important event. The soldier in question told Juzjani that Bakhtiyar Khilji had attacked what the historian described as a fortified city, a qilla. After advancing to the gateway with 200 heavily armed cavalry, he says, Bakhtiyar seized and plundered the site. The soldier described the inhabitants of the place as Brahmins with shaved heads, men that we can readily identify as Buddhist monks. After slaying the monks, according to Juzjani, the troops learned of a great number of books at the site, library, and so they inquired what were these books about. When local people explained their contents, the Turks realized that what they had thought was a fortress, and the Persian word here was hisar, was in fact what the soldier called a madraseh, which is to say a college. They also learned that in the local language this place was called a vihara, or monastery. In other words, the Turks had mistaken the monastery for a fortress and its monks for Brahmins. The monastery in question is identified as Odantapur, you see on the map here, located in modern city Bihar Sharif. From there, Bakhtiyar Khilji advanced into Bengal, and in 1204 he attacked Lucknowati, here, the capital of the Sena dynasty, which he overthrew, or at least drove very far east into Bengal, overthrew from western Bengal, for sure, thereby inaugurating Muslim rule in this part of the Delta. In 1234, just 3 decades after this attack, a Tibetan Buddhist monk, Dharmaswami, made a pilgrimage into what is modern Bihar, spending 2 years studying 2 important Buddhist sites in the region, Bodh Gaya and Nalanda. He spent 6 months in Bodh Gaya, and reported that the site's diamond throne, where the Buddha found enlightenment, had been largely deserted and that only 4 monks were present. One of them told him that most monks had fled out of fear of Turkish soldiers. The monks had also blocked the Mahabodhi temple with bricks and placed a substitute image near it, evidently anticipating a possible attack from Turkish forces. This is in 1234, 30 years after Bakhtiyar Khilji. So to be sure, what we're hearing here is not the forces of Bakhtiyar Khilji, but rather those of Turks then occupying the region well after Bakhtiyar's raid. In any event, there is no evidence that Bodh Gaya had been seriously damaged, for Dharmaswami describes at length, and I'm quoting him here, the many wonders and numerous exceptionally holy objects of worship that he saw there, unquote, including the Bodhi tree, the image in the Mahabodhi temple, the additions that have been made by Ashoka, sacred tooth, 2 stone footprints of the Buddha, and the diamond throne itself, that is, the empty throne made of stone together with its stone railing. Bodh Gaya's square walls were also very much intact. At this time, the pilgrim noted 300 Theravada Buddhist monks from Sri Lanka dominated affairs at the site. He also described 12 functioning monasteries in the Bodh Gaya region. In short, 30 years after Turkish armies swept over eastern India, Bodh Gaya appears to remain an active pilgrimage site, but the region had certainly fallen on hard times. The number of monks that had dropped there the number of monks there had dropped drastically from 6 centuries earlier, when the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang reported seeing 1,000 monks there. Now that probably was an exaggeration. Don't think they could have probably accommodated that many. But anyway, that was what he thought he was seeing. Of course, we don't know by how much Bodh Gaya's monastic population might already have dropped before the Turkish invasions had even begun. But we do know that from the 8th to the early 12th centuries, the Palas, once the dominant power in southern Bihar, had been a major patron for the region's great monasteries. But from the 1130s on, that dynasty had been in rapid decline, being pressured by invasions of the Sena kings of Bengal from the east and by the Bahagarabads from the west. In eastern Bengal, royal patronage of Buddhist institutions had ceased even earlier. For centuries, the Chandra kings of the southeastern delta had proclaimed their devotion to the Buddha and affixed the Buddhist seal on their copper plates. But already by the early 11th century, those same kings ceased proclaiming their devotion to the Buddha, and by the mid-11th century, a new dynasty would appear, the Varmans, who were devout Vaishnavas. We also know that there was fierce rivalry between Brahmins and Buddhists throughout the 12th century in eastern India. That is, well before the Turkish invasions. By that time, the once extensive trans-regional Buddhist merchant networks, formerly another mainstay of support to the monasteries, had also seriously diminished. Visual evidence, art and sculpture, shows both Shaivas and Vaishnavas trying to appropriate Buddhist supernatural beings in the art, and vice versa. Now, I want to come back to that point later on. In short, in a number of ways, institutional Buddhism, that of the Sangha and the great monasteries in eastern India, were clearly in decline even before Bakhtiyar's invasion. On the other hand, recent research has discovered the presence of Buddhist images, sculptures, and temple remains dating to the 9th through the 13th century, turning up in as many as a third of the villages in present-day Gaya district in Bengal. This clearly suggests that lay Buddhism appears to have been thriving quite independently of the great monasteries, at least in this region. Surveys of other parts of Bihar and Bengal haven't been done, so I can't make any generalizations moving beyond that region. And certainly, such support is not likely to have, but we have little evidence of lay support for the great monasteries. And certainly, such support is not likely to have offset the diminishing support that had been lavishly given by royal courts, by big landlords, and especially by Buddhist merchant communities, all of which had been slacking off. In any event, Dharmaswami's account indicates that since the onset of Bakhtiyar's assault on Bihar, occasional harassment of Bodh Gaya and a general sense of insecurity pervaded the atmosphere. All of this points to unsettled times, both before and after Bakhtiyar's invasion. Now, from Bodh Gaya, our Tibetan pilgrim moved on to the great scholastic monastery of Nalanda, where he stayed another 6 months. It was 1235 by this time. Although Bakhtiyar had completely destroyed Odantapuri, as described by Juzdani, we have no direct evidence that he attacked either Bodh Gaya or Nalanda. Excavations at Nalanda reveal a sprawling academic institution where thousands of monks had once resided. Dharmaswami reported seeing 7 temples, 14 large monasteries, and 84 small monasteries, each containing 84 cells. And he noted that many of the site's brick structures were undamaged. He also found Nalanda's surrounding wall intact, with images of Tara and other deities near the entrances to the site's eastern and western gates. But it seems that here, as at Bodh Gaya, there had been random acts of vandalism by Turkish units sometime between Bakhtiyar's invasion of Bihar and Dharmaswami's arrival 30 years later. And, like Bodh Gaya, Nalanda had also fallen on hard times by 1235. For Dharmaswami states that Turks had damaged some of the site's smaller monasteries, and that nobody was then taking care of them or making offerings to them. Moreover, he found only 70 monks and an elderly abbot still residing there, and even they felt threatened by the pervading disorder and pervasive fear of further attacks by Turkish authorities. So clearly the place had become a shadow of its former self. So, if Bodh Gaya and Nalanda had escaped Bakhtiyar's invasion, a fourth major Buddhist site in the region, Vikramashila, was not so lucky. Like Odantapuri, Vikramashila was a great scholastic institution. And, like Odantapuri, it was mentioned by Dharmaswami as having been destroyed by Bakhtiyar Khilji. But the two sites present very different profiles today. Because Odantapuri is completely covered over by the modern city of Bihar Sharif and therefore unexcavated, we really don't know the monastery's overall plan. But Vikramashila has been properly excavated, and what its plan reveals suggests something of why it, unlike Nalanda or Bodh Gaya, was targeted by Bakhtiyar Khilji. Like several big monasteries in eastern India, Vikramashila features a central, and you see it here, this aerial picture. It features a central cruciform shrine having several cult-like chambers, surrounded by a number of monastic cells, with a single entrance guarded by a monumental gateway complex on the northern side. Such layouts like this that you see architecturally here are conventionally seen as architectural projection of the Rajadhatu Mandala, which in Vajrayana Buddhism is the diamond realm, or the metaphysical space inhabited by the 5 Tathagatas, the 5 great Buddhas, central to the sort of Tantric Buddhism that was then flourishing in eastern India and would also flourish in Tibet. But, as Birendranath Prasad has recently noted, this architectural layout seems also to have had the political meaning of conferring magical ritual protection on the site's patron state. That is, the site was thought to radiate a claim of universal overlordship of the patron dynasty. Among the monasteries having this form, Vikramashila was the most renowned. Taranatha, who wrote his History of Indian Buddhism in the early 17th century, says that rituals were performed at this site for the protection of the Pala state by monks during the reign of Dharmapala, who had founded this monastery. By the time of Bakhtiyar's invasion, however, Pala authority had diminished considerably. But we do know that just several decades before that invasion, a local chieftain, Sahura, had been appointed by the declining Palas to govern the region on their behalf, and that Sahura himself claimed independent, even imperial status. This then points to an alternate explanation for Bakhtiyar's destruction of the site, of this site, and one that happens to align with the principal rationale for the destruction of Hindu temples by Indo-Turkish forces throughout India, namely the need to remove the most visible structure associated with an enemy king's claims to sovereign authority. In addition to these Buddhist complexes in present-day Bihar, at the time of the Turkish invasion, several other large monastic complexes were located further east in Bengal here. One of these, located in northern Bangladesh, was Somapur, which was built in the late 8th or early 9th century. Like Vikramashila, and possibly, although we don't know, Odantapur as well, Somapura was not only a large academic complex that could house many hundreds of monks, it also had the same layout as did Vikramashila, that is, a cruciform shrine with several cult-like chambers surrounded by many monastic cells and a single entrance guarded by a monumental gateway complex on the northern side. Its central shrine has three terraces rising to 70 feet in height, and surrounding it are 177 cells that would accommodate up to 800 resident monks. Most importantly, the Somapura complex seems to have had the same political significance as that of Vikramashila. That is, it was a site conferring magical ritual protection on the patron state and radiating the claim of universal overlordship of its dynastic patron. But remarkably, this site does not appear to have suffered any damage by Bakhtiyar Khilji when he conquered Bengal in 1204, even though he is known to have marched through this region in the course of his conquest there. On the other hand, there is evidence that this site had been attacked and damaged by Hindu kings before Bakhtiyar Khilji's arrival in the region. This evidently relates to the fierce and growing competition between Brahmanical and Buddhist authority in Bengal and Bihar during the 11th and 12th centuries. Prasad shows that at both Somapura and Vikramashila, Brahmanical themes were subordinated to Buddhist themes by depicting Hindu images on the lower plinth of the central shrine. So as a result, as devotees would enter the monastery and begin to circumambulate the central shrine from the north side, they would first encounter images of Ganesha, then Krishna, and end up with two of Shiva. But it was a Buddha image that occupied the most prominent position in the center of the main eastern wall. Similarly, in the basement of the central shrine, there are 17 depictions of Krishna, 5 from the Ramayana, 7 of Shiva, and 2 of Ganesha. But an image of Padmapani in the middle of the southern side of the basement held special significance. Being the only Buddhist deity amidst these Brahmanical deities, Padmapani was seen as presiding over these Brahmanical deities shown on the wall, process of subordinate integration. But this sort of iconographic strategy came at a cost, for it was the Padmapani image that was singled out for destruction when, in the mid-11th century, Hindu invaders sent by the Raja Avanga burned parts of the monastery, killed its chief monk, and burned down a neighboring temple dedicated to Tara. So, to conclude, I've suggested that victorious armies and ruling authorities have many options when dealing with monuments associated with their adversaries, or when asserting sovereignty over new land. They range from non-intervention, imitation, iconic reuse, captured trophies, redefinition, defacement, and finally, demolition, whether strategic or total. When Turkish armies encountered Buddhist institutions in eastern India, they chose the first and the last of these many options, each choice dictated by specific contexts. In eastern India, 2 of the sites that faced the initial attacks by Turkish armies were severely damaged or destroyed, namely Odantapuri and Vikramashila. According to the Tibetan chronicler Taranatha, the local ruler in southern Bihar, who succeeded the Palas in the mid-12th century, had militarized those two monasteries in order to protect them from the Turks. The chronicler is quite explicit on this point. Quoting him directly here, Taranatha wrote that, quote here, to protect Odantapuri and Vikramashila, the king of Magadha converted the monasteries into fortresses and stationed soldiers there, unquote. This would explain why invading Turks were inclined to view these sites as military assets, and why they described one of them, Odantapuri, as a killa, or a hisar, both terms referring to a fortified establishment. It was only after attacking that site, Odantapuri, that they discovered that it was actually an educational institution. Vikramashila, by contrast, was destroyed not by mistake, and not only because it could have been seen as a military asset, but also because it was understood, or certainly seems to have been understood politically, as analogous to royal temples of the great Hindu Maharajas. For as I noted, the Turks quickly came to understand that royal temples lavishly patronized by Indian kings were fundamental to establishing, reconfirming, and contesting their claims to royal sovereignty. Therefore, to overthrow any such dynasty, it was necessary to desecrate the most visible manifestation of the king's sovereign rule, which was his royal temple. On the other hand, none of the great Buddhist centers in Bengal, eastern Bengal, northern and eastern Bengal, Somapura, Jagadhara, Salban, none of them shows evidence of violent desecration by Turkish armies. Terracotta images that adorn the lower walls of Somapura, for example, were not defaced or modified in any way. This was so, notwithstanding that immediately after Bakhtiyar Khilji's conquest of Bengal, 1204, those sites lay in areas that were directly administered by governors of the Delhi Sultanate from 1204 and from 1342 by the independent sultans of Bengal. How can one explain these different responses to the great Buddhist monasteries, great complexes of eastern India? The likely explanation, in my view, is that by the time of the Turkish armies reached the Bengal sites, the Sena dynasty had already been overthrown. During his invasion of Bengal in 1204, Bakhtiyar Khilji had gone straight to the Sena capital at Lakhnavati, deposed the king, and established Turkish rule at that same site, making it his own capital. While the defeat of the Sena dynasty, which in any event is not known to have patronized the great monasteries at all, Shumapur and the other Buddhist monasteries of eastern Bengal were no longer politically active. The light had, in a sense, gone out, and therefore they were innocuous. In this respect, the Turks' non-intervention in places like Somapura compares with the non-intervention of other Turkish armies when confronted with sites that were once prominent but had become apolitical, such as the great Shiva temple at Khajuraho that I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, the case of Somapura does reveal yet another response to a defeated adversary's monumental architecture, namely that of strategic demolition. But in this case, interestingly enough, it was not the Turks that were the actors. Rather, it was Hindu kings who engaged in a sort of iconographic warfare with their Buddhist adversaries. Although the attack on Somapura by the Hindu king of Vanga resulted in the death of the chief monk and the burning down of the temple dedicated to Tara, it seems that the introduction of Brahmanical images in the monastery was what had triggered the assault. For the game of subordinate inclusion was a very risky enterprise. Once Hindu images were introduced in monastic space, the game was over, so to speak. Most donors to the great monasteries in the 12th century were not identifiably Buddhist at all. This, in turn, forced the big monasteries to incorporate non-Buddhist deities into their pantheon, since outright rejection of them was not an option. This not only compromised the Buddhist character, indeed the Buddhist identity of the monasteries, but placing Brahmanical images in a subordinate status to Buddhist images could also, and did, provoke attacks by their Hindu adversaries. All of this is to say that when trying to explain the messy business of the politics of architecture, context may not be everything, but it's certainly a lot. Thank you very much. And as I said, I'd be very welcome to listen to any questions, comments, concerns. This is I must emphasize, something that I'm just kind of beginning to make a foray into. But I'm convinced that by understanding context of how architecture and politics relate, we might be able to solve a lot of problems that have remained stubbornly unsolvable for many generations, including perhaps especially this vexed issue of what happened to Buddhism in India. So, with that, let me
The floor is open.
open the floor anywhere.
Thanks for a wonderful lecture. I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit about whether there's any trace of a connection between demolition of sites and attempts to impose any kind of state religion or piety on elites or broader segments of the population in any of these cases?
Yeah. Demolition, connecting demolition with imposition of...
Sure,
of-
whether
of-
one sees that as being part of the logic of demolition or not at all, or in a different relation.
My initial response is no. I think if the primary concern is fundamentally political, then the construction of a mosque, in my view, is more of a political statement than it is a religious one. Now, it's true that obviously large mosques are intended for worship by Muslims. It goes without saying. But I'm thinking of that mosque that was put right in the heart of Warnagal, replacing the site of Swayambhu Shiva, which had been the focal point of Kakatiya dynastic royalty, and everybody knew that. So building the mosque was, as I would argue, is a statement of a profound political change that, in this case, Ulugh Khan, the future Muhammad bin Tughlaq, really wanted to make very clear. But his retention of those 4 Toranas is what's really interesting, because there it seems to be, there's an attempt to make an assertion that, look, this used to be something which it no longer is. And we're going to use those same Toranas to focus on a new dispensation that's coming, which I think is primarily a political dispensation. But that's an interpretation. David.
Hi. I had 2 things. One is I've been very impressed by the work that's been done on the Bamyan Buddhas and the extent to which the Bamyan Buddhas were, in a sense, reconceptualized as landmarks and as beautiful, huge expressions of the wonders of God's creation and so on by Muslim rulers, and so that it actually remained, Bamyan actually remained a very active Buddhist site for a long time under Muslim
Yes.
rulers. So
Yes.
that's one thing. There's another sort of angle to or another sort of, what would you call it, another, an eighth option might be there, which is, it's not just non-intervention, but it's actually a reconstruction of something as actually being. So that was one thing. But the other more important thing that's on my mind is that it seems to me that what you're saying is that the Turks are entering into a situation where Buddhism was already under attack by Hindu rulers and Brahmanical power structures and
Without
so on
doubt.
and so forth. And so that it seems that there's another sort of level to the conversation,
Yes.
which wouldn't be about Turks, but would rather be about Hindu rulers in relation to Buddhist things. And so Kanchipuram, of course, is a wonderful place for looking at this where a Buddhist, what was a Buddhist center was actually turned into a huge Brahmanical place with
Right.
actually, the subordination of Buddhism.
Right.
And I think the connection between the politics and what you might call religion is not about belief, but rather about ritual, rather about the utilization of these spaces as sort of magical ritual sites for the production of powers that are sort of beyond the everyday, military.
Right.
And so that's the link, I think, between what we might call religion and the politics. And I think it's definitely the case in
Yeah.
places like the temples in Kanchipuram and so
Yeah.
on. It's absolutely
Yeah.
a difference in the way that the ritual space was deployed and utilized over a much earlier period, actually, than what you're talking about. But still,
Yeah.
I think the process was ongoing for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think what has to be done is systematic studies of different parts of India. I mean, as I intentionally focused only on one region, and even that is far from complete. So there's so much more that we don't know simply because excavations haven't been completed. But yes, we're not going to get an overall picture until we start bringing in the Kanchipurams, all kinds of other sites that had been Buddhist, then become something else, even before the Turks arrived. All of which is trying to get beyond, I hope we're getting beyond, the kind of colonial Orientalist image of, fanatic Muslims coming in and with one blow wiping out a world religion. I think we've done that. We've come that far. Now we have to do the hard work of connecting a lot of other dots to find out what really did happen. And I'm only suggesting that, I think looking at iconography, which is kind of my closing point here, might be a fruitful way to think about how this game of iconographic subordination is a very dangerous game to play. And it obviously backfired in the case of Bengal.
Okay, we have Mana and then Jay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I guess if I can ask you to, I understand you're not moving spatially, but if I can ask you to think spatially, another space, think about sin, and a little earlier, because I think what you're drawing our attention to is the kind of an architecturally or materially significant ways in which memory operates and history operates. And I'm wondering if there is a textual analog to it. So in the case of sin, while we do not have material remnants of temples, we do have, like in the Chachnama, a history of a temple being converted from a Buddhist temple to a Brahmin temple, and it's narrativized through various kind of sources and means. So I was wondering, can we kind of say that the processes that you are drawing our attention to that are happening through icons and through material, remnants, is there an analog to it in our textual narratives that are being created during the same 13th century that you are linking here? And and then back to the space that you are talking about, I'm thinking about accounts like Miragavati, in which many of these sites are going to replay in a third dominion of, kind of how to think of the relationship of sacrality to particular source tradition. So just if you can kind of reflect on.
No. Thank you so much for raising that, because the short answer is I don't know whether this is what has to be done to find out to what extent do we have. I mean, you do have things like the Chachnama for your sin, which gives us, I'm trying to remember, you're obviously much more familiar with that than I hadn't looked at it for many years, but do we hear much in terms of textual evidence in there that would either confirm or disconfirm the kind of points that I was making?
I mean, it confirms the point you're making, because it's set in the 13th century.
Right.
It's talking about how kind of a partial and then a total destruction can happen. So, but it's textual because we don't have, obviously, until the colonial period, we don't have excavatory evidence, and it has stopped since 1968, anyways.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
don't
So,
have any contemporary archaeological evidence on this.
so the challenge is going to be to find more textual evidence.
Right.
And the problem here, and this is a really profound schism in the whole our field, that people who study texts are in a different college, a different part of the university than the archaeologists who are way over there, and they're using different kinds of evidence, and they are sadly not talking to each other as much as they should.
So both camps are here right now.
Both camps are here. Great. Well, let's
You can talk to them
we can
right
talk-
now.
okay,
You have
okay.
the opportunity.
Right, right. But it's good. That is to me. I've been reading a lot of archaeology in the last month. Actually, I've been down at Penn, and I'm really excited by the prospects. I mean, there are some really smart archaeologists in Bangladesh right now who are doing exactly what I'm talking about. Is you know, forget about what textual evidence might tell us. Let's look at the material evidence, and it's very exciting what's happening. So that to me is the challenge, combining these two. And what I discussed tonight is just kind of a sliver of a beginning of maybe one way of trying to put those two together, using Dharmaswami and Taranatha and Juzjani and what literal textual sources we do have. How can they inform us and enlighten us of the material evidence that we're finding, which is not only the architecture, you know, the archaeology, the sites, but the artistic evidence that I think is the other part of the equation.
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a broad question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think aside from the political concerns and, you know, as sort of whether or not these sort of acts of desecration or however you want to call them are motivated by politics or zeal or anything else, I'm also wondering about the economic dimension of this, right? Presumably these great viharas and mega temples, which receive a lot of state pressure, would have been
Right.
sites of a huge amount of movable wealth. But then again, you know, you can imagine in the course of the war and in the subsequent sort of, desecration of these spaces, like the ordinary commercial activity that these places undoubtedly would have attracted might be
Yes.
disrupted.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's anything in the material record that might be suggestive of, you know, what were the kind of economic sort of motivations or implications of these events.
I really can't say. I mean, pilgrimage sites, almost by definition, become sites of lots of economic activity, right?
Yeah.
Money's exchanged for material stuff, donations, especially the latter.
I'm as now. Right?
Well, yeah, always right, exactly. But related to that, what we do know is that there had been a long-term decline of the presence or the profile of Buddhist merchants in a trans-regional sense. You know, when we look at early Buddhism, merchants were all over the place. Probably with the rise of Islam and the integration of at least the western half of India with the Middle East. I'm thinking of the Pratiharas, the Paramaras, the Rashtrakutas and Chalukyas, and so forth, in the western part, were integrated into that new economic system, whereas the eastern India was not. It was left out. And I don't know, well, what that might translate to is less money sloshing around in eastern India, might otherwise have been used for the support of monasteries. Because merchants had been major patrons. And that economic dimension of it is a very important one. I want to think about that a lot.
We have
Thank you.
two here.
Audrey. Oh, sorry.
So, thank you, I thought that was really fabulous. So my question is, so you distinguish sort of lay Buddhism from institutional Buddhism at a certain point, and then you noted that there's evidence that lay Buddhism continued, like past this period, and was quite robust in certain parts of Gaia.
Wait,
so-
can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
Actually, no. The evidence we have of lay Buddhism, like I mentioned, a third of the villages in the Gaia district, we have, you know, votive offerings, clearly Buddhist. But from an iconographic standpoint, they're clearly situated in the Pala period, not the post-13th century.
So earlier.
So we cannot say that lay Buddhism was thriving after the 13th century on the basis of that kind of material evidence.
So I guess, like, thinking about the work of people like Abhishek Amar and Jeanette Kim,
Right.
who
He's the one I had in
brought
mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Who have sort of brought in some of this evidence. And I mean, some of that, some of them do argue it goes into the early 15th century. So I suppose my question would be, would you extend your theory here, as you laid it out, to also explaining the decline of lay Buddhism, right? In which case the claim would be that it can't survive without the big institutions, or do you think that these are sort of two fundamentally different puzzles?
Well, maybe one could say that if we look at it as a dialectic kind of relationship between the Sangha, obviously, and the lay population, historically, the lay supports the Sangha. When we don't find the Sangha being supported by the lay, that we see clear evidence of the decline of the monasteries. That does not necessarily mean that the lay Buddhism is also declining. And this is why what Abhishek Amar is trying to do is so fascinating. I don't think he has enough evidence over a broad enough area to really make firm conclusions about how long chronologically that evidence of lay Buddhist activity and thriving persists. So that remains an open question to me.
Okay, we have two, oh, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Two questions over here.
I don't know if my question is a continuation of Madan's question, but it struck me that the sources that you're using, I think I find your account very persuasive that all of these are sort of political rather than religious conquests. But the impression that I got was that the documentary sources are narrating them in religious terms. It seems to me that seems to be something that is continuous across all of even the first part of your talk. When you compare it to other forms of, previous kind of takeover in other places.
Right.
The form of narrative is always religious, regardless
the form
of
of what?
The narrative form, the narrative explanatory form is religious, even though you're right that if you look at the evidence or more broadly, it just seems that these are political events.
Yeah.
Now, the question that I have is that, why is it that, for instance, there's certain, specifically in the case of Islamic conquests or sort of demolitions across India, that takes a religious form, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but you don't seem to encounter a similar internal explanatory narrative when Hindu rulers are destroying Buddhists. That is, it's not seen, or maybe I'm wrong, are there equal the documentary evidence of Hindu rulers destroying Buddhist sites? Is it also narrated similarly in religious terms, would you say?
Yeah. It's very difficult to say. I really don't. I mean, I don't think we have enough evidence on either the textual or the archaeological side.
But am I right in my impression that the narrative form is, even the two sources that you mentioned, one is the Buddhist traveler and the other is the, are they narrating it in terms of a sort of religious destruction, or are they talking about it in political terms?
Yes. Well, these are when they're pilgrims, they are pilgrims after all. They are almost bound to see it in religious terms, and not in political terms. So in other words, their evidence is seen through the lens of what a pilgrimage sees as a dying tradition. Look at the Chinese pilgrims who show up. They say the same thing. We got 3 or 4 of them spread over a couple of centuries. They're not talking about politics. They're counting the number of Buddhist monks and monasteries.
In this case, is this just then a templatized form of sort of Persianate narrative, which describes and which necessarily describes their conquests in religious terms? Are they simply being, is this fidelity to genre that they describe it in religious terms, or?
Well, it's also true. Okay, yes, absolutely. Many of these Persian chronicles certainly see the world through religious terms. I mean, I've seen many Persian chronicles that are claiming, for example, a pious sultan has bashed so many temples when we know it didn't happen.
Yeah.
You know, so there's no question that on both sides of this equation, whether it's a Tibetan Buddhist pilgrim or whether it's a pious chronicler, they do see the world through religious terms. And inevitably, when the British come along and write their chronicles and histories, they're oftentimes following that same framework. And that has kind of bled into our own modern day understanding of seeing everything in terms of religion. That's, I think, the nature of the source.
Yeah,
But,
so
yeah.
I would rather have two questions, small questions, but one has got to do with Dr. Ambedkar's explanation of the decline of Buddhism, and he gives 3 reasons, and I can see 2 directly overlap with your explanations, the
Okay.
state patronage and the persecution by the Brahminic forces.
Right.
The third one that he explains is that the way Buddhist priesthood is organized and the way Brahminical priesthood is organized.
Yes.
And he argues that it was possible for slain priests of Brahminical variety to be replaced because every Brahmin was considered to be a potential priest. There was that, in a way,
Right.
continuity, but it was not possible for the Buddhist priest to be replaced. And then he emphasizes this point that this is one of the crucial reasons why after Turkish attack it was not possible for the Buddhism to revive while Brahminism could revive. The second question has got to do with what my friend was just pointing out here. How we look at the past, say if in the present, through whatever contingent forces, a certain view of looking at the past has become sedimented. That I believe that because I believe in one form of religion, I got to be iconoclast, I got to be Buddh Shikan, not Buddh Parast, and look, our ancestors have done it, and I'm doing it, and I will also do it if given an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, in the context of democratic contestation, when we always have a competitive forces, one group claiming that we have done it, this is my religious phenomena, we have done it and we'll do it, and others saying that we will defend it, and therefore we will take your narrative that we have done it for religious reasons, and then we will build our narrative. In this context, because we are in the context of democratic revolution, how do we bring that element of theological justification? I'm an iconoclast, I got to be a Buddha Shikan, not Buddha Paras, and look, there is a precedent and we have been doing it. In fact it goes, if I can just point out one example in the Tablighi Jamaat circle in India, it's very clear that it is right at the foundation of Makkah that our Prophet in a way first destroyed the idols and then that's how it was created.
Right.
So the myself is boasting it, using historical sources, justifying it, and then in the democratic context there is this counter myth making. So the evidence-based, say for example, rationalist explanation, if it does not integrate that theological locus, so to say, then how far will it impress upon the existing political players in terms of actual translation of the historical experience and evidence, actual translation into political process? So this is the second question.
So you're referring to, in other words, how modern day, contemporary, today's politicians and political leaders are likely to interpret these
including the
events.
social movement players,
Yeah.
and how they use the evidence of history in particular ways, unless we account for that theological justification that I am an iconoclast, I got to be an iconoclast, we have been an iconoclast, and look, this is the textual evidence, this is the architectural evidence, we have been doing it and we will do it. And then the counter building, let us defend. The last hour right is very clear, we got to defend ourselves and therefore everyone has to organize against this. So both are part of myth, of course.
Right.
But the challenge is how to translate the historical evidence, architectural texture, into the political meaning of the present.
Well, this is the challenge. I mean, the temptation to fall back on reductionist and essentialist arguments because any actor belongs to religion X, Y, or Z, therefore the action will be that, this, and that, the other. That is what I think is a major, major problem whenever we try to study religion. This is why I've made such an effort to look at a panoply of a variety of different kinds of options that are available when power meets architecture. The whole rationale for this typology was to kind of think about why certain outcomes occur and others do not. Getting rid of the idea of what any actor might happen to belong to. That was my purpose in presenting this typology using examples from all over the world. Some of dealing with different religions, but nonetheless, contexts rather than religion, in my argument, are what drive historical outcomes. Does that begin to answer?
I think what you're also you started off mentioning the Babri Masjid, and
absolutely, that's what got me on this whole
exactly. So there was
rabbit
a
hole.
very specific,
yes,
at some level political agenda that you've got to disrupt the narrative that's going on today.
I wanted to know why it was that people were rationalizing the destruction of Babri Masjid the way they were. And when I realized that they were hanging on to outrageous numbers, just pulling them out of thin air, I said, well, this is crazy. Someone's got to look at the evidence. Nobody had done that, by the way. Nobody had actually looked at epigraphs, inscriptions from, where you do have smoking guns. You do have actors boasting that they had done this or that. This is the whole point. So yeah, this is what did get me started on it.
I think a key.
I think you were very keen by the end to stress the risks in subordinated iconography.
Right.
And I'm just curious about whether you'd like to link that with possible risks of leaving in the partial demolitions that you discussed at the beginning.
Yeah.
Of leaving certain things as a way of saying this is what was overcome.
Right.
This is what, and it's not subordination really, but it's a kind of triumphalist.
That's correct.
So you want to think of the risks of that in certain contexts as being similar to the risks of subordination. I mean, triumphalism is not, of course, subordination, but it has it's a cousin of it, and so that should carry risks with it prima facie.
Yes. I agree. The subordination argument is a very tricky one to work with. But I'm convinced, though, that the introduction of Brahmanical images in Buddhist monasteries needs to be looked at more carefully, and to think about how that might have actually undermined the whole Buddhist project to begin with. Which, if true, if this whole line of reasoning is accurate, there's an enormous irony in this whole incredible story.
Okay, well, we have one last question.
If you're shutting down, it's
well,
fine. But
one last question and then we'll shut.
I guess I'm still finding myself, and I want to go back maybe to, I asked this question and Akhil's and many other questions too, because there seem to be two ways to kind of get at what you're arguing. One would be to say, and I was just thinking about sort of the response to things like the Babri Masjid and the contemporary sort of bulldozer politics, as it were, that somewhere one thinks that there is a kind of radical break, right? That there is something that happens in the past that can't happen in the present. Mm-hmm. So that explanatory structure of temple defacement, desecration, and so on and so forth, is part of a kind of history of precisely the kind of material landscape perhaps even a kind of textual edifice that supports it, but that there is some kind of a radical break between that and what happens now, right? So that earlier explanation can't really quite transcend the break between, let's say, what I think what Ayaz is calling democratic politics, as it were, and a very new way in which explanations begin to have a relationship between the so-called secular and the religious, as opposed to perhaps the period that you're speaking about. So one would be to assert that there's a kind of strong break. The other is to say we have a much, much more complicated playing field than Hindus and Muslims and temples being desecrated and so on and so forth. The presence of Buddhism and the history of Buddhism and Brahmanism actually completely transforms the way in which we think about millennial history at all. You seem to be playing with both sets of explanations, but it's a little hard to figure out where you come down on either of those explanations and when, and what it is sort of in the aid of. So I think my real question to you is, what is the kind of problem that you're really trying to explain? It surely can't be, well, they thought there were thousands of temples and there were only 82. There's a broader psychic, political problem of explanation of the source and so on and so forth. So maybe it would help to get a sense of the stakes of this argument.
Yes, let me just say this. If I hear your question correctly, you're drawing attention to a real break between actors in pre-modern period who viewed monuments and architecture, religion itself, and today where we have a dissemination of knowledge, of information reaching popular audiences that were not perhaps possible or available in pre-modern times. So the way we think about the interaction of religion and politics today may not be relevant to earlier times. And that's a very good point, which I'm happy to concede and
or that we need to
think more about.
The present too.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. That's a good.
Thank you.
Thank you.